In this video, we will be exploring Spinoza's theory of knowledge, and at the very end, how this relates to his view of the human will. We've already seen that for metaphysical reasons, global external world skepticism is not much of an issue for Spinoza, as it is for the dualistically inclined philosophers that were Spinoza's contemporaries, such as Descartes and later on Kant. Because for Spinoza, there's no separation of mind and body that would create questions about how the mind is connected to the material world epistemically. There's no separation, no substantial separation between bodies that would create a question about the reality of the bodies beyond what my immediate senses tell me about my own body. For Spinoza, it's a postulate that my body is constantly exchanging material with the other surrounding bodies in the continuum. So external world skepticism is not a major focus of Spinoza's theory of knowledge, but at the same time, there is for Spinoza a standard of perfection for knowledge that the very nature of the human mind often blocks it from achieving, and that is his concern. In particular, the mind's nature as a mere subset of the infinite set of ideas that comprise God's mind renders its ideas, the human mind's ideas, often inadequate. The mind's reliance on the way its body is affected by other bodies in order to know anything about itself or these other bodies. This also renders its ideas often inadequate. In Proposition 16, Spinoza begins to lay out the source of much of the confusion and distortion that will affect human knowledge. So if we look at this on page 44, beginning in our text, he says, "The idea of any mode in which the human body is affected by external bodies must involve the nature of the human body and at the same time the nature of the external body." Demonstration. For all the modes in which a body is affected follow from the nature of the affected body and at the same time from the nature of the affecting body. So the idea of them will necessarily involve the nature of each body. And so the idea of each mode in which the human body is affected by an external body involves the nature of the human body and of the external body. QED. Corollary 1. From this it follows first that the human mind perceives the nature of a great many bodies together with the nature of its own body. Corollary 2. It follows second that the ideas which we have of external bodies indicate the condition of our own body more than the nature of the external bodies. The second corollary is especially noteworthy. All we know of the nature of external bodies is how our body is affected by them. Knowledge of external bodies is really just a sort of knowledge of our own body. So it's going to be partial, it's going to be perspectival. Now, Proposition 17 sounds like Spinoza is addressing the problem of external world skepticism. But it turns out he's actually doing something different. And the key phrases in this proposition in its demonstration are the phrases regard and have an idea of. So pay particular attention to them. And ask yourself, are we to give these phrases a psychological or an epistemological reading? So let's take a look here at Proposition 17. If the human body is affected with a mode that involves the nature of an external body, the human mind will regard the same external body as actually existing or as present to it until the body is affected by an affect that excludes the existence or presence of that body. Demonstration. This is evident. For so long as the human body is so affected, the human mind will regard this affection of the body, that is, it will have the idea of a mode that actually exists an idea which involves the nature of the external body, that is, an idea which does not exclude but posits the existence or presence of the nature of the external body. And so the mind will regard the external body as actually existing or as present until it is affected, and so on, QED. So, on a psychological reading of what Spinoza is claiming here, we could say the human mind is naturally caused to believe an external body exists in the circumstances described. On an epistemological reading of what Spinoza is claiming here, the human mind is naturally caused to know with certainty, another question, but it would be naturally caused to know on this reading that an external body exists in the circumstances described. The demonstration references the first corollary of Proposition 16, which asserts that the mind perceives the nature of a great many bodies together with its own body. And this suggests the epistemological reading. However, Spinoza is really interested here in a kind of error, which suggests the psychological reading. An external body affects our body, causing the human mind to regard it as actually existing until that affect is, so to speak, canceled by a countervailing effect. So what does he have in mind? He seems to be interested in giving a theory of the imagination and explaining how this relates to error. In particular, in explaining how we can have ideas of things present to us that do not exist. So the corollary here says, although the external bodies by which the human body has once been affected neither exist nor are present, the mind will still be able to regard them as if they were present. Demonstration. While external bodies so determine the fluid parts of the human body that they often thrust against the softer parts, they change their surfaces with the result that they are reflected from it in another way than they used to be before, and still later when the fluid parts by their spontaneous motion encounter these new surfaces, they are reflected in the same way as when they were driven against those surfaces by external bodies. Consequently, while thus reflected, they continue to move. They will affect the human body with the same mode, concerning which the mind will think again that is, the mind will again regard the external body as present. This will happen as often as the fluid parts of the human body encounter the same surfaces by their spontaneous motion. So although the external bodies by which the human body has once been affected do not exist, the mind will still regard them as present as often as this action of the body is repeated. Now, the rather crude physiological account is not really material to the philosophical point that Spinoza is making here, which is that it belongs to the nature of the kind of thing our body is, that it can retain somehow or other, whether by Spinoza's mechanism or another, it can retain within itself the changes caused by external objects, even when those objects are no longer present to it. And that is certainly true, regardless of whatever the mechanism is exactly. And this feature of our bodies allows the body to form images of things that are not present. In other words, this feature allows the body to imagine. So we see right around the center of page 46 there, he says, to retain the customary words, the affections of the human body whose ideas present external bodies as present to us, we shall call images of things. They do not reproduce the figures of things, and when the mind regards bodies in this way, we shall say that it imagines. And you can see that he seems like what he has in mind here primarily is something like the after images that are formed. If you stare at the sun, for example, and close your eyes, you'll see this after image, even if you go inside and you're no longer looking at the sun. So, here the true upshot of the proposition we're talking about here, which remember is Proposition 17, comes out. Spinoza is saying that the impression of an external body will remain with the mind until it is canceled out by another affection, and that this can lead to error if it leads the body to imagine without the mind having the idea that the imagined thing does not exist. So he mentions here in the next paragraph after I just left off, I should like you to note that the imaginations of the mind considered in themselves contain no error, or that the mind does not err from the fact that it imagines, but only insofar as it is considered to lack an idea which excludes the existence of those things which it imagines to be present to it. For if the mind, while it imagined non-existing things as present to it, at the same time knew that those things did not exist, it would, of course, attribute this power of imagining to a virtue of its nature, not to a vice, especially if this faculty of imagining depended only on its own nature. That is, if the mind's faculty of imagining were free. So what Spinoza is presenting here is a theory of error. A theory of error, at least of one type of error, which is imagining the presence of something, which is due, of course, to this sort of after effect of external bodies impinging upon the human body. We imagine the presence of something without having the concomitant idea that the thing you're imagining does not exist. We do this all the time, and Spinoza is saying that this is a vice of our nature. Okay, Proposition 18 presents a theory of memory and the association of ideas. It says, if the human body has once been affected by two or more bodies at the same time, then when the mind subsequently imagines one of them, it will immediately recollect the others as well. Both memory and this sort of association of ideas, I associate the glass with water because I've seen them together so often, that kind of idea. Memory and association of ideas depends upon impressions left by external bodies on a particular human body. And such impressions occur according to the order and connection of the affections of the human body. The personal history, as it were, you might say, of the way in which our personal experiences of a given individual have unfolded, the way your body has been affected in your personal history. That's the way in which these impressions are left. And so our particular past experience causes us to associate ideas in the imagination according to the order in which they have been habitually encountered by us in the course of experience. Last paragraph of the Proposition 18 section, this is on page 47. He says, and in this way, each of us will pass from one thought to another as each one's association has ordered the images of things in the body. For example, a soldier, having seen traces of a horse in the sand, will immediately pass from the thought of a horse to the thought of a horseman, and from that to the thought of war, and so on. But a farmer will pass from the thought of a horse to the thought of a plow, and then to that of a field, and so on. And so each one, according as he has been accustomed to join and connect the images of things in this way or that way, will pass from one thought to another. Right? So this is a function of the imagination. We see the way in which the imagination is, as we would now probably most likely say, a subjective effect of the mind. It's something that is going to vary depending upon the different individual experiences of different human minds and the way in which they, as individuals, have been differently affected by bodies. Proposition 19 makes another remarkable point. It says, the human mind does not know the human body itself, nor does it know that it exists, except through ideas of affections by which the body is affected. In other words, our knowledge of our own body itself is really just the knowledge of how external things affect our body. There are not really two separate sets of cognitions of my body and cognitions of external bodies. Actually, for Spinoza, these are inseparably joined and interwoven with one another, and it's impossible to have the one without the other. But Spinoza has another deeper point to make here. We don't have adequate knowledge of our own body. Adequate knowledge would involve a complete grasp of the entire web of causal relations in which our bodies intertwine. But this is possessed only by God. We're only aware of the nature of our own body insofar as we are directly affected by external bodies. However, God sees the complete causal network that our body is bound up in. So in the demonstration, he says, "For the human mind is the idea itself, or knowledge of the human body, which is indeed in God, insofar as he is considered to be affected by another idea of a singular thing, or because the human body requires a great many bodies by which it is, as it were, continually regenerated. And the order of connection of ideas is the same as the order of connection of causes. This idea will be in God insofar as he is considered to be affected by the ideas of a great many singular things. Therefore, God has the idea of the human body, or knows the human body, insofar as he is affected by a great many other ideas, not insofar as he constitutes the nature of the human mind. That is, the human mind does not know the human body. But the ideas of affections of the body are in God insofar as he constitutes the nature of the human mind, or the human mind perceives the same affections, and consequently the human body itself is actually existing. Therefore, to that extent only, the human mind perceives the human body itself." So Spinoza is making a crucial contrast here between two ways of knowing. First of all, insofar as God constitutes the nature of the human mind. That's one way of knowing. And the second is insofar as God is affected by a great many other ideas. And then this first one, insofar as God constitutes the nature of the human mind, this is the superior godlike way of knowing that perceives the logical necessity of all the causes that go into bringing a body into existence, perceiving things in their logical order and therefore adequately. Or later, Spinoza will say intuitively. And here, Spinoza says, in concluding this demonstration, that we only know one thing about ourselves in this way, this first way, this perfect godlike way, and that is that we exist. So we know that we exist in a kind of adequate way, in a kind of intuitive way, I think he would want to say eventually. But as far as the other aspects of our human body, we don't know. We know the body exists. We know that with a kind of immediate self-evidence, but we don't know all the causes that are involved in the constitution of the body. Because there'll be some modifications to make to this later on. We can have a kind of a more abstract knowledge of the human body that's adequate. But in terms of, the details, the rich concrete details of your particular body, that's not going to be the case. And the second is the second way of perceiving or knowing ourselves is the way we perceive things in their temporal order. As our experiences unfold, that's how we humans know ourselves in the everyday course of experience, which he says, insofar as God is affected by a great many things. That is to say, insofar as we are affected by a great many things in the course of going through our everyday, day-to-day lives and butting up against the world, so to speak. We come to know ourselves that way. But this is an inadequate knowledge of ourselves, an inadequate knowledge of our bodies. Proposition 20 states that in addition to the idea of the human body, aka the human mind, there's also an idea of the human mind. An idea of the human mind. So, I should say an idea of the idea that is the human mind, to avoid confusion. So the second order idea is what he's referring to here. He says, page 48, Proposition 20, there is also in God an idea or knowledge of the human mind, which follows in God in the same way and is related to God in the same way as the idea or knowledge of the human body. Demonstration. Thought is an attribute of God, and so there must necessarily be in God an idea both of thought and of all its affections, and consequently of the human mind also. Next, this idea or knowledge of the mind does not follow in God insofar as he is infinite, but insofar as he is affected by another idea of a singular thing. But the order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of causes. Therefore, this idea or knowledge of the mind follows in God and is related in God in the same way as the idea or knowledge of the body. The human mind is an affection of God, or a mode of God under the attribute of thought. But God has an idea of all the affections or modes of God. Therefore, in addition to the idea that is the individual human mind, there's an idea of that individual human mind and an idea of an idea. And it seems like this corresponds to God's knowledge of you. But this idea of the mind, of your mind, just take the specific example, this idea of the mind in God is a complete or adequate or perfect idea of the mind. And so that's going to involve the idea of the, as it were, the logical antecedents, the causes of your mind as well. That complete knowledge, remember, for Spinoza, knowledge is a matter of knowing the causes. So there's not only your mind in God, but there's also this additional idea, which is the complex idea of the cause that, as it were, is responsible for your existing as a mode of God. So contrast this kind of knowledge of the ultimate causes of your mind that exists in God with the ordinary course of our existence as human beings, where we know ourselves, we have no idea of the cause of ourselves, right? Why am I here? What caused me? We know ourselves only very partially, inadequately, and imperfectly. Proposition 21 asserts that the idea of the mind is united to the mind in the same way as the mind is united to the body. In other words, the idea of the mind is substantially identical to the mind itself, which is substantially identical to the body. They are, as Spinoza says in the Scolio, one and the same individual. So it's all part of the same substance, which of course is God. This identity between the idea of the mind and the mind itself has an important consequence that's drawn in Proposition 22, which is the human mind perceives not only the affections of the body, but also the ideas of these affections. Not only the affections of the body, but also the ideas of these affections. The human mind perceives not only all the affections of the body, but also the ideas that the mind has of all these affections. In other words, it seems that Spinoza is saying here that the human mind has a thoroughgoing knowledge of itself, of all of its ideas. Of course, this is only insofar as the human mind is in God. This does not imply that we have, as individuals, have a consciousness of all our ideas, of course. But it does perhaps suggest that Spinoza is here anticipating the notion of the unconscious that was made famous in later European intellectual culture. Proposition 23 does for our self-knowledge of the mind what Proposition 19 did for the self-knowledge of the body. It posits that we only know the mind through the ideas of the way in which the body is affected. Proposition 23 on page 49, the mind does not know itself except insofar as it perceives the ideas of the affections of the body. In sum, to take stock at this point, by this point in his exposition, Spinoza has put forth two very different notions of knowledge of the human self, mind and body both. First, there's a kind of indirect, partial, incomplete knowledge of the individual human mind and body that we get from the everyday course of experience, in which the mind is caused to have a series of ideas that correspond to the series of bodily changes that its corresponding body undergoes. That's the first type of knowledge, partial, incomplete, subject to the temporal conditions and the temporal unfolding of the encounters that the human mind experiences and undergoes in relationship to external objects that teach us about the nature of the body and the mind. And then, on the other hand, there's the idea of the mind that is in God, which is the perfect and complete grasp of all the causal connections that cause the ideas to arise in the individual human mind, with its corresponding causal series of changes in the body as well, of course, as these are also part of the infinite mind of God. So you have here really sort of two standards. There's sort of the everyday common standard, which Spinoza regards as very inadequate and prone to error, and the standard of God's perfect knowledge, which is the complete knowledge of all the causal connections and interrelationships in their proper logical dimension, not merely the way in which things happen to be encountered in our haphazard and random everyday experience. So this leads to the first discussion question. What do you think is involved in the possession of self-knowledge? What do you think is involved in the possession of self-knowledge? What is the standard of self-knowledge, in your view, if you reflect upon this question? What is self-knowledge? What constitutes self-knowledge? Do you agree with Spinoza that there are two possible types of standards of self-knowledge? The adequate idea of ourselves as it exists in the mind of God, and the inadequate idea that we get of ourselves from the way in which we're affected by external bodies. Do you think that we can ever know ourselves adequately? So that's the first discussion question. What do you think is involved in the possession of self-knowledge? What is the standard of self-knowledge? Do you agree with Spinoza that there are two possible types of standards? The adequate idea in the mind of God and the inadequate idea that we get from the way we are affected by external bodies? Do you think we can ever know ourselves adequately? Now, Proposition 24 will probably not seem controversial. It says, the human mind does not involve adequate knowledge of the parts composing the human body. It seems obvious that there are many parts of my body that I do not have adequate knowledge of. For example, I don't know how many cells I have, or my blood cholesterol level, or my urine pH, or what's in my large intestine, etc. I'm generally not aware of what's going on in my large intestine, unless something is affecting me in there. You know, if that green chili I had for lunch is disagreeing with me, then I'll know, right? I become aware of my body only in those respects in which things are affecting my body. Proposition 25 is the first in a series of important conclusions that Spinoza draws from all this. The idea of any affection of the human body does not involve adequate knowledge of an external body. Let's read the demonstration. Proposition 25, the idea of any affection of the human body does not involve adequate knowledge of an external body. Demonstration. We have shown that the idea of an affection of the human body involves the nature of an external body insofar as the external body determines the human body in a certain fixed way. But insofar as the external body is an individual which is not related to the human body, the idea or knowledge of it is in God insofar as God is considered to be affected with the idea of another thing which is prior in nature to the external body itself. So adequate knowledge of the external body is not in God insofar as he has the idea of an affection of the human body, or the idea of an affection of the human body does not involve adequate knowledge of the external body. What's going on here? The basic idea here is that what we know of bodies from the way they affect the human body is not what they are in themselves, not in the case of external bodies and not in the case of our own body. So I come to have ideas about a particular external body by the way in which it causes modifications in my body. And I certainly know that they both exist according to Spinoza. I know the glass exists, I know my body exists, and I know that they affect each other. But all I get is the picture of how it affects me. And all I know of that body is limited to this particular intersection, you might say, with me, right? And therefore is not something that is going to, as it were, plumb the depths of the nature of that external body. It just is a very partial idea of what it has to do with me. So why isn't this adequate knowledge? Well, again, Spinoza would contrast the nature of the knowledge that God has and the nature of the idea that the human mind has. God has adequate knowledge because God knows the complete and total cause of the object through the corresponding idea of the object that is in God. But the human mind lacks this. It has only a very partial, perspective-bound idea of the object, whether this is the external body or whether it's my own body. The human mind only knows the external body as that external body affects it, as it is affected by it. And the human mind only knows its own body in the way in which it is affected by this body and other bodies. So, we can often see this in toddlers. They're experimenting with the nature of their body by learning the causal effects other bodies have on it. I guess that burns, or I guess I can't walk through walls, etc. That's kind of the basic idea. But of course, this is not very far cry from an adequate knowledge of either their own body or external bodies. In Proposition 27, Spinoza posits that all I know of my own body is how the external object affects me. The idea of any affection of the human body does not involve adequate knowledge of the human body itself. Such ideas are going to be confused ideas. Why? Well, we get an answer in Proposition 28 in its demonstration when he says, Proposition 28, the ideas of the affections of the human body, insofar as they are related only to the human mind, are not clear and distinct, but confused. Demonstration. For the ideas of the affections of the human body involve the nature of external bodies as much as that of the human body, and must involve the nature not only of the human body, but also of its parts. For the affections are modes with which the parts of the human body, and consequently the whole body, are affected. But adequate knowledge of external bodies and of the parts composing the human body is in God, not insofar as he is considered to be affected with the human mind, but insofar as he is considered to be affected with other ideas. Therefore, these ideas of the affections, insofar as they are related only to the human mind, are like conclusions without premises. That is, as known through itself, they are confused ideas. The key point here is in this last line. The ideas of the affections are like conclusions without premises. So, they're things that we can know because we memorize them, right? But we're not able to really prove them. We're not able to really deduce them. And that's what our everyday course of experience is like. We come to be aware that we are affected by various things, but we're not really aware of the underlying causes that leads to us being affected by things. Because all of that goes, as it were, beyond the human mind's compass and into the larger mind of God. Right? So God knows these things insofar as God has these other ideas that extend beyond the compass of your particular set of ideas that constitute your mind. But you don't have these other ideas because you're restricted to within the compass of your own mind. So we only know the effects, not the causes. And thus our idea is confused. We may associate it with imaginary causes instead of the real ones. Remember how an idea is associated with whatever else we were affected by at the time we had the idea. This is how things like sports superstitions arise, right? I was wearing these socks when the Lobos last won a football game, so if I want them to win again, then I should wear these lucky socks. That kind of idea. I mean, that's an example of confusion. And this suggests then that our idea gets clearer the more we know, not just the effect, but the causes as well. In sum, neither the knowledge of the external material world nor of our own body is adequate insofar as I know it merely through the way in which it is affected by, or these bodies are affected, my body is affected by external bodies. I'll say that again. In sum, neither the knowledge of the external material world nor of my own body is adequate insofar as I know it merely through the way in which it's affected by external bodies. So Proposition 29 extends this conclusion to the knowledge of the mind as well. The idea of any affection of the human body does not involve adequate knowledge of the human mind. If the knowledge of the human body on which the idea of the mind depends, remember we know the mind only through the body, so if the knowledge of the human body on which the idea of the mind depends is inadequate, then the idea of the mind, of course, is going to be inadequate as well. That's the argument, essentially. Demonstration. For the idea of an affection of the human body does not involve adequate knowledge of the body itself, or does not express this nature adequately, that is, does not agree adequately with the nature of the mind, and so the idea of this idea does not express the nature of the human mind adequately, or does not involve adequate knowledge of it. The corollary here that he adds to this proposition introduces a useful bit of terminology to encapsulate this inadequate type of knowledge, which he calls perception of things from the common order of nature. Perception of things from the common order of nature. This is knowledge from the way that the body is affected by external bodies. Perception of things from the common order of nature is knowledge from the way the body is affected by external bodies that takes place in a seemingly random, haphazard order, and thereby suggests that there's a chance or contingent nature to experience. That causes and effects are contingent or random as they happen to the body. But this, for Spinoza, will be an illusion. It's due to the extremely partial character of any human being's experience. It's relative and perspectival character. Spinoza calls this mutilated knowledge. So if you look at this, he says in this corollary on 51, the bottom, from this it follows that so long as the human mind perceives things from the common order of nature, it does not have an adequate, but only a confused and mutilated knowledge of itself, of its own body, and of external bodies. For the mind does not know itself except insofar as it perceives ideas of the affection of the body, but it does not perceive its own body except through the very ideas themselves of the affections of the body, and it is also through them alone that it perceives external bodies. And so, insofar as it has these ideas, then neither of itself, nor of its own body, nor of external bodies does it have an adequate knowledge, but only a mutilated and confused knowledge. Scolio, next page. I say expressly that the mind has not an adequate, but only a confused and mutilated knowledge of itself, of its own body and external bodies, so long as it perceives things from the common order of nature, that is, so long as it is determined externally from fortuitous encounters with things to regard this or that, and not so long as it is determined internally from the fact that it regards a number of things at once to understand their agreements, differences, and oppositions. For so often as it is disposed internally in this or another way, then it regards things clearly and distinctly, as I shall show below. So we have two sort of ways of ideas arising. There's from the common order of nature, and this corresponds, I think, to what we normally think of as experience, right? This ideas that arise just from your living your life. You're just experiencing things as you go about your life, navigating through the world. That's from the common order of nature. Various ideas arise, right? But this is what he calls inadequate, confused, mutilated, and so on. And then there's what he calls from things determined internally, or from the internal disposition. And this sounds like it's something like what we normally would call a rational or reasoning reflection, where, we're reasoning, we're reflecting on things, right? We're actively, we're not just, this is sort of a passive way of acquiring ideas, this is an active. Here, through these internal dispositions, we are coming to engage with our own thoughts of things. And this is a way in which we can acquire clear and distinct ideas, he's going to ultimately say. So you see very clearly here a kind of classic divide between an empiricist approach to knowledge and a rationalist approach. And Spinoza quite clearly regards this as being the superior mode of acquiring adequate ideas, through the internal disposition of the mind rather than just passively acquiring things through the common order of nature. This leads to a second discussion question. Is Spinoza right in his view that knowledge from the common order of nature is only an inadequate, confused, and mutilated type of knowledge? If so, what, if any, role does experience play in our knowledge? How would an empiricist respond to Spinoza, do you think? Is there a way to improve knowledge from the common order of nature so as to dispel its confusion and make it adequate? So that's the second discussion question. Is Spinoza right in his view that knowledge from the common order of nature is only an inadequate, confused, and mutilated type of knowledge? If so, what, if any, role does experience play in our knowledge? How would an empiricist respond to Spinoza, do you think? Is there a way to improve knowledge from the common order of nature so as to dispel its confusion and make it adequate? All right. Now, Proposition 32 introduces the standard of truth to which all adequate knowledge must aspire. This is right at the top of 53, page 53. Proposition 32, all ideas insofar as they are related to God are true. Demonstration, for all ideas which are in God agree entirely with their objects, and so they are all true. Propositions 33 and 34 make the interesting point that all ideas are, in a sense, true. 33 says there's nothing positive in ideas on account of which they are called false. 34 says every idea which is in us is absolute or adequate and, every idea which in us is absolute or adequate and perfect is true. So ideas are modes of God that are identical to the modes that they are the ideas of, according to Spinoza's theory. But that identity or agreement ensures their truth. So no ideas are positively false. All have something true about them because they are in God. But there are degrees of truth and adequacy. Inadequate ideas are those that are far from the standard of truth. But again, what does that mean? What makes an idea inadequate? Well, Proposition 35 gives the answer. Inadequacy is really due to the partiality of an idea. When it is taken in isolation from its logical connections to all other ideas. Think about when you're sworn in a court of law, right, and you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. In other words, there's a way in which you can speak falsehood, even though everything you said is technically true, if in the context of the questioning you don't say the whole truth. And that gives you kind of a rough initial idea of the way in which ideas can be true, but nonetheless inadequate. So this is a pretty illustrative passage, 35. He says, falsity consists in the privation of knowledge which inadequate or mutilated and confused ideas involve. Demonstration. There is nothing positive in ideas which constitutes the form of falsity, but falsity cannot consist in an absolute privation, for it is minds, not bodies, which are said to err or be deceived, nor also in absolute ignorance, for to be ignorant and to err are different. So it consists in the privation of knowledge which inadequate knowledge of things or inadequate and confused ideas involve. Okay, so it's a privation of the knowledge of adequate ideas. And compared to adequate ideas, inadequate ideas are deprived of something. Scolio. He says, in Proposition 17, Scolium, I explained how error consists in the privation of knowledge. But to explain the matter more fully, I shall give one or two examples. Men are deceived in that they think themselves free, i.e., they think that of their own free will, they can either do a thing or forbear doing it. An opinion which consists only in this, that they are conscious of their actions and ignorant of the causes by which they are determined. This, then, is their idea of freedom, that they do not know the causes of their actions. They say, of course, that human actions depend on the will, but these are only words for which they have no idea. For all are ignorant of what the will is and how it moves the body. Those who boast of something else, who feign seats and dwelling places of the soul, usually provoke either ridicule or disgust. Similarly, when we look at the sun, we imagine it as about 200 feet away from us, an error which does not consist simply in this imagining, but in the fact that while we imagine it in this way, we are ignorant of its true distance and the cause of this imagining. For even if we later come to know that it is more than 600 diameters of the earth away from us, we nevertheless imagine it as near. For we imagine the sun so near, not because we do not know its true distance, but because an affection of our body involves the essence of the sun insofar as our body is affected by the sun. So this passage is very illustrative, as I suggested. It suggests that the inadequacy of ideas is due to an incomplete knowledge of the causes of a thing. And hence, correspondingly, the way to improve our ideas is by improving our knowledge of the causes. Given the pessimism that Spinoza seems to have about acquiring adequate ideas of the world, our body, or even our own mind from the common order of nature or random experience, we might well wonder how or whether it's possible for human beings to ever achieve adequate ideas for Spinoza, and hence whether it's possible to achieve knowledge at all. Well, fortunately, Spinoza immediately allays such fears. In propositions 36 through 40, he lays out a type of adequate ideas that even human minds are able to acquire. And these he calls the common notions. The common notions. So what are the common notions? Well, he says that these are common to all things. Common to all things. So in this context, in particular, that means common to all bodies, things that are common to all bodies, equally in the part as in the whole. So common to all things, equally in the part as in the whole. And because of those two features, they don't depend on the particular way in which the body is affected. They're the particular mode of body, you could put it that way. These things are adequately perceived by the human mind just insofar as it perceives itself to be a body. So look at proposition 38 there on page 54. He says, those things which are common to all and which are equally in the part and in the whole can only be conceived adequately. Let A be, this is the demonstration. Let A be something which is common to all bodies and which is equally in the part of each body and in the whole. I say that A can only be conceived adequately, for its idea will necessarily be adequate in God, both insofar as he has the idea of the human body and insofar as he has ideas of its affections, which involve in part both the nature of the human body and that of external bodies. That is, this idea will necessarily be adequate in God insofar as he constitutes the human mind, or insofar as he has ideas that are in the human mind. The mind, therefore, necessarily perceives A adequately, and does so both insofar as it perceives itself and insofar as it perceives its own or any external body. Nor can A be conceived in any other way. Corollary, from this it follows that there are certain ideas or notions common to all men, for all bodies agree in certain things which must be perceived adequately, or clearly and distinctly by all. So these things are adequately perceived by the human mind just insofar as it perceives itself to be a body. In other words, to perceive oneself to be a body, I perceive myself to be a body, you perceive yourself to be a body, that is at the same time to perceive what is common to all bodies clearly and distinctly. That's what Spinoza seems to be saying here. To perceive oneself to be a body is at the same time to perceive what's common to all bodies clearly and distinctly. And hence, this can only be conceived adequately. Well, it seems pretty clear here that we need some examples to understand whether this is a plausible view or not. So what are these common notions? Unfortunately, Spinoza does not say what the common notions are specifically in the text, but we can infer that they have to be features that are common to all bodies. So what features are common to all bodies? Simply by virtue of being modes of extension. A body will have such and such features. That's the claim. With just a little reflection, we can suggest what he probably is thinking of here. First, there are certain logical properties. Logical properties like being identical to itself, being a unity, having the sum of its parts quantitatively equal to the whole, and so on. These logical properties. Those are going to be common to all bodies, and equally in the part as in the whole. Doesn't matter how small of a part of the body or how large of a body you're considering. It's all going to have these properties of being identical to itself, being a unity, etc. Second, there are certain other, what we might call geometrical properties that are going to be common to all bodies. Occupying space, having a shape, being divisible, being subject to Euclid's laws, etc. These geometrical properties are going to be common to all bodies simply by virtue of being a body. And then third, there are going to be physical properties, such as being able to causally affect other bodies, being mobile, and being subject to the laws of physics. So we have logical properties, geometrical properties, and physical properties that are going to be among the common notions. The ideas of these properties will be common notions. As he says, common to all men, and that can be perceived only adequately or clearly and distinctly, merely by virtue of being embodied, of being that exists in the mode of extension. You have a clear and distinct idea of these things. The inclusion of physical properties in this list, if it's right, suggests that we can, for Spinoza, have adequate ideas of the external bodies that we experience, but only in the case of basic physical operations. Only in the case of the basic physical operations. So we can do, basic physics as a way of understanding our causal interactions with external bodies. I think that's Spinoza's conclusion. In the demonstration for Proposition 39, Spinoza indicates that there is a way, after all, in which we can acquire adequate knowledge of external bodies from the way in which we're affected by them. We can acquire adequate knowledge of an external body when we are affected by an external body through what we have in common with it. And we cognize it through common notions. In those cases, we can have adequate knowledge. So that's the position of Proposition 39 that he tries to demonstrate there. We'll skip over that for the sake of time, the good demonstration. And go on to this other question, which is, one might wonder whether all universals should be included among the common notions, as well as these logical, geometrical, and physical notions. Right? So why does Spinoza isolate these concepts of logic, geometry, and physics from other universal concepts, if what we're concerned with is the commonness? You might say, well, maybe all universals can be known clearly and distinctly. Well, Spinoza's understanding of how universals come about excludes this possibility. In the first Scolio in Proposition 40, Spinoza argues that universal terms arise because the human body, he says, this is the top of page 56, the human body, being limited, is capable of forming distinctly only a certain number of images at the same time. If that number is exceeded, the images will begin to be confused, and if the number of images the body is capable of forming distinctly in itself at once is greatly exceeded, they will all be completely confused with one another. And then skipping down here to the paragraph after the next, he says, these notions they call universal, like man, horse, dog, and the like, have arisen because so many images, for example, of man, are formed at one time in the human body that they surpass the power of imagining. Not entirely, of course, but still to the point where the mind can imagine neither slight differences of the singular men, such as the color and size of each one, etc., nor their determinate number, and imagines distinctly only what they all agree in, and only insofar as they affect the body. For the body has been affected most by what is common, since each singular has affected it by that property, and the mind expresses this by the word man, and predicates it of infinitely many singulars. For as we have said, it cannot imagine a determinate number of singulars. So notice, we're talking about a function of the imagination here. I recognize, in the common course of experience, I encounter many men. These affect me in the way in which things affect the imagination, according to the earlier account. But because my imagination can't keep all these men straight that I've met, right, it forms this general notion of man, a universal of man, and that comes to be connected with the word. What's the problem with this? Well, if this is indeed the mechanism by which the ideas of universals are formed, one can see that each human mind will form different ideas of universals based on differences in human experience. But it should be noted that these notions are not formed by all men in the same way, but vary from one another. in accordance with what the body has more often been affected by, and what the mind imagines or recollects more easily. For example, those who have more often regarded men's stature with wonder will understand by the word man an animal of erect stature. But those who have been accustomed to consider something else will form another common image of men. For example, that man is an animal capable of laughter, or a featherless biped, or a rational animal. So universal ideas, since they're formed on the basis of diverse personal and individual experiences, will not have the same status as the common notions, which are based simply on the nature of extension alone and every extended being's own understanding of itself as an extended being. These universals are going to have this kind of subjective relativity to them. So they're not included among the common notions that have this kind of adequacy. All right, so in Scholium 2, Spinoza sums up all the foregoing considerations by laying out a three-tiered hierarchy of the ranks of knowledge. And this is listed quite clearly here, so I don't think I need to repeat this on the whiteboard, but refer to this page 57 in our text. We can see the Roman numerals where he lays this out. So the ranking of knowledge, as it were, from least to greatest. First, we have sort of the perceptions that don't rise to the level of knowledge: inadequate, confused, mutilated ideas and perceptions. And this is ideas that arise from random experience. That would be the lowest rank. Random experience. These are confused, mutilated ideas. The second is opinion or imagination. And this is the first sort of level of knowledge. It's inadequate, but it's still knowledge. He describes this as knowledge from signs. For example, from the fact that having heard or read certain words, you recollect things, form certain ideas of them, like those through which we imagine things. Opinion or imagination. Opinion or imagination. Sort of like, common sense knowledge, things that people say, things that we heard somewhere, sometime. That's inadequate, but he still is counting it as the lowest rank of knowledge. Then we have reason or common notions. Knowledge from reason or common notions. And this seems to correspond roughly to what we might think of as adequate or scientific knowledge. This is logical, mathematical, physical knowledge that deduces ideas from logical, geometrical, or physical laws. So that's reason or common notion. That's a higher rank than opinion or imagination. And now to this he adds a somewhat mysterious sounding rank, the highest, which he calls intuition. In addition to these two kinds of knowledge, there is another third kind, which I shall call intuitive knowledge. And from this kind of knowing proceeds an adequate idea of the formal essence of certain attributes of God to the adequate knowledge of the formal essence of things. And this sounds like the kind of knowledge that God has. And one plausible interpretation of it, there's a lot of controversy and dispute among commentators that don't understand this, but one plausible interpretation seems to be that intuition proceeds in proper logical deductive order to deduce our scientific laws, or logical laws, or geometrical laws from their ultimate causes in God, or places them within their ultimate context, and thus intuits the necessity of such laws somehow. Another interpretation would be that this kind of knowledge surpasses the need for rational deduction altogether, and it sees the truth of something immediately in one intuition. And this second interpretation seems to fit with Spinoza's example that he goes on to give in the next paragraph there, page 57, of the ratio problem that ends the Scolio, where we see the solution in a single glance. Intuitive knowledge. Well, however we interpret it, it's clear that intuition is the supreme degree of knowledge for Spinoza, and this has something to do with its complete and perfect grasp of the causes or reasons that rationally lead to a conclusion. In Proposition 41, Spinoza blames opinion for the existence of falsity. Falsity occurs, in other words, not from confused or mutilated perception per se, as in random experience, but from imagining that we know something when we do not. The higher ranks of knowledge are all carriers of truth because they involve adequate ideas. Now, a question naturally arises here. How do we know that they involve adequate ideas? How do we know that they involve adequate ideas? How do we know that knowledge from common notions involves adequate ideas? At Proposition 43, Spinoza argues that if you have a true idea, then you know you have a true idea. The demonstration of this depends upon Proposition 20, that there is in God an adequate idea of the human mind. If you have a true idea, that means for Spinoza that you have an adequate idea. But that means that this same mind will have an adequate idea that it has an adequate idea. And so you'll know that you have a true idea. Note that this does not imply that if you do not have a true idea, then you know that you do not have a true idea. That is, this doesn't imply immunity from error. It just implies that if your belief is in fact true, then you'll be able to know this self-evidently. The final propositions of Part 2 link knowledge, necessity, and freedom of the will. Proposition 44 lays out the central aspect of rational knowledge according to Spinoza. It has a deductive character. It involves deducing the causes or reasons for things. And for Spinoza, as we've seen, causes are logically necessary reasons. The corollary and scholium to Proposition 44 connect the common belief in the random, chance, or contingent character of events to the operation of the imagination in the place of reason. When we do not deduce the logical causes of a thing through reason, we have a tendency to pay attention only to the effects and to imagine it has no cause or a random cause. The imagination perceives the connection of things based on the random past experience and association of ideas of the individual. Remember my lucky socks that caused the Lobos to win, right? The imagination not only leads to false beliefs about particular cause-effect relationships, it also leads to an overall global mistaken belief in the existence of contingency, in the existence of randomness or chance causes. But this is an illusion for Spinoza. Reason views things as God sees them, which Spinoza famously termed subspecie aeternitatis, the Latin phrase. We'll come back to that in the future, in a certain aspect of eternity. Right? It perceives the necessity of all things as a consequence of the necessity of God's eternal nature. That's the way reason perceives things. Propositions 45 through 47 develop the view that it's possible for human beings to actually know God's eternal and infinite essence. Of course, we cannot know God in every one of its attributes. However, we can have an adequate understanding of God's eternal and infinite essence under the attributes of extension, at least, and maybe some aspects of thought as well. I'm not clear about that. But certainly under extension, in our geometrical and physical knowledge of the extended world, we can have adequate ideas of the essence of God. We can have adequate ideas of extension as it's conceived through God. We can have an adequate knowledge of God's essence under those attributes. In other words, since God is the medium, as it were, through which we conceive of anything adequately, in conceiving of anything adequately, we're also coming to know God itself adequately. So the study of logic, the study of geometry, the study of modern physics, or in Spinozistic philosophy, or study of Spinozistic philosophy, these are all ways of coming to know God. Okay, that brings us to the culmination, propositions 48 and 49, which represent the culmination of Spinoza's foundational account of the human being. Their purpose is to argue, based on the theoretical foundations he's been laying so far, that human free will is an illusion. The connections between his theory of cognition and his theory of volition, or the will, have already been anticipated in the Scholium to Proposition 35. Remember back on page 53, this idea that men are deceived in that they think themselves free. You read before? The idea of free will is simply an imagined, confused idea of a pseudo cause, which the ignorant man posits because he's ignorant of the actual causes that determine his action with an ironclad logical necessity. Proposition 48 states, go back here, in the mind there is no absolute or free will, but the mind is determined to will this or that by a cause which is also determined by another, and this again by another, and so on to infinity. Um, the demonstration is the mind is a certain determinate mode of thinking, and so it cannot be a free cause of its own actions. Rather, it must be determined by a cause which is also determined by another, and so on to infinity. So that's familiar to us by now. But in other words, our so-called will is, for Spinoza, reducible to a series of thoughts. Recall that this is already asserted in Part 1, Proposition 32. The will is only a mode of the intellect. The will is only a mode of the intellect. However, all modes of the intellect follow causally with strict logical necessity from the essence of God. Each human mind itself is caused by a prior idea in God, and hence there is no absolute or unconditioned power of freedom. Proposition 49 includes a long scholium that finishes the second part and the proposition itself concerns the mental act of affirmation and negation, and then the scholium deals with various objections and replies that Spinoza gives. I will leave that up to you to decide what you want to make of these. But first, just talking about Proposition 49 itself, in the mind there is no volition or affirmation and negation except that which the idea involves insofar as it is an idea. Spinoza recognizes that the idea of free will is traditionally understood to be a mode or affirmation of negation. The will is a faculty for saying yes or saying no to things. That's the traditional view. In Descartes, the relation of the intellect and the will is understood in the following way, that the intellect, for Descartes now, proposes or entertains ideas, and the will either affirms these as true or denies them as false. In other words, for Descartes, the will is the faculty of affirmation or negation. It is responsible for bad intellectual judgments, affirming what is false, denying what is true, as well as bad moral choices leading to evil behavior, denying the good, affirming the bad, and so on. But Spinoza rejects this. For Spinoza, contra Descartes, each idea itself contains an affirmation. To have an idea of something, X, for Spinoza, is to affirm some truth. For example, to have the idea of a triangle is to affirm a number of things, such that its 3 angles equal 2 right angles. If you don't affirm that, you do not really have the idea of a triangle, at least not adequately. Alternatively, you might say you have a false idea of a triangle, which means that it's an idea that's deprived of some crucial information or fact about what a triangle is. So every idea involves a kind of many affirmations, depending on how complex the idea is. And in this way, Spinoza dispenses with Descartes' attempt to argue for a separate, absolute faculty of volition over and above the intellect. For him, the will and the intellect are one and the same. And that's the corollary there on page 63. The will and the intellect are one and the same. So all volitions are really just ideas of a particular type. Like all ideas, they involve affirmation and or denial. And like all ideas, they're thoroughly determined by antecedent ideas in a causal series that determines them with necessity from all eternity. Okay, so this leads us to the third discussion question. Has Spinoza succeeded in disproving the notion of free will? What are the strongest and weakest aspects of his argument against freedom of the will? How might a defender of free will respond to Spinoza? Third discussion question, has Spinoza succeeded in disproving the notion of free will? What are the strongest and weakest aspects of his argument? And how might a defender of free will respond to Spinoza?